You're listening to the Assembly on Pediatrics podcast, brought to you by the American Thoracic Society.
So, thank you everyone for listening to this podcast. Today, we're going to cover some tips for studying for the pediatric pulmonary boards. And my name's Christina Gallardo. I am a pediatric pulmonologist at UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. And I'm joined by two panelists today, Dr. Ryan Perkins and Dr. Tricia Lenhart-Pendergrass. And today we'll be sharing our own experiences with studying and try to give you guys some helpful tips as you think about how to approach preparing for the boards. I will let Tricia go ahead and introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Tricia Lenhart-Pendergrass. I am also a pediatric pulmonologist at University of California, San Diego and Rady Children's Hospital. Thanks for having me here today.
Thanks. And then I'll go ahead and let Dr. Ryan Perkins introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ryan Perkins. I'm an adult and pediatric pulmonologist at Boston Children's Hospital and Brigham and Women's in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm also happy to be here today.
Thanks. So we wanted to do this podcast in particular because in 2022, the pediatric pulmonary board pass rate was an abysmal 69% compared to the 86% pass rate in 2020. And this was probably due, at least in part, to the impact of COVID on our training. But we wanted to try to prepare everyone as best as possible to try to make that pass rate a lot better for this year. The exam is about the length of the site exams, if anyone took the site exam. So it's a half day, approximately 4-hour exam with 2 different sections. And each section is about 100 questions. There is an optional 30-minute break in between sessions, and you are able to review notes or look at your phone between sessions. Now, let's talk a little bit about resources that we use to study. Tricia, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, the primary resource that I use and that I think many people use to prepare are the prep questions. Those were, I think, the best resource for me. I feel based on my own study experiences, I do really well with questions. So I found those to be really high yield. And then they also, in addition to just practicing the questions, there's a pretty detailed explanation with each question about why the correct answer was correct and the wrong ones were not. And so I would spend quite a bit of time, especially early on in my studying, going through all of the text and information that accompanied the questions. So I found that to be my most useful resource, something you can kind of just even fit into smaller blocks of time too. If you don't have time to do hours of studying on end, you can do a few questions and still get something out of it.
Yeah, that's great. I also heavily use the prep questions. Ryan, what about you? What did you use to study?
Yeah, so like Tricia, I also used the 3 years of the prep questions. I ended up doing them multiple times, and the first go around really focusing, just like you both have said, on the vignette critique following the question. In addition to what makes the right answer the correct answer, I also thought about how would the vignette change potentially if it was going to be one of the other answers, to try to imagine, a different type of question. But I ended up doing those questions twice. I'm also someone who learns by questions and had access to the chest seek questions. I believe there's only around 20 or 30 of those. So I did those questions as well and found them to be helpful. The other resource that I used was West Physiology, and I tended to focus more on the questions at the back of each chapter. The questions don't necessarily mimic the board formatting of questions. However, it really does do a nice job of sort of reinforcing the concepts that are presented in West, and I found those were really helpful in thinking about the physiology questions on the board. The only other thing that I looked at, and I did not read it in depth, but I did pull Kindig's up and flipped through sections looking at imaging for representative CT scans or chest X-ray findings, just to familiarize myself with sort of best case examples of those.
Yeah,
Great.
building on the comment about West, I will say sometimes it's really helpful for learning the physiology. And sometimes I didn't want to necessarily sit down and read a textbook, but I know a number of the lectures from West are recorded. You can even find West kind of going through the chapters himself on YouTube. And so I watched some of those videos as well, just to kind of sometimes get a visual or even kind of an audio version of that if that's more convenient for you than looking at a textbook.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I also used West and I also didn't like totally read it in depth, but I did appreciate the questions at the end. And I thought those were pretty helpful. In addition to those resources, I also did the CHEST Pediatric Pulmonary Board Review course. I have heard that it isn't happening this year for 2024, but it does look like people can buy access to the 2022 recorded course lectures. And it consists of about 46 hours of recorded lectures. You do get access to the recorded and live lectures for a year. And it was taught by a host of really like legitimate faculty, and they each presented topics that they had expertise on. It is really pricey, but for me, I thought it was an extremely valuable resource to try to organize my studying to make sure that I covered the important topics for the board. So I would recommend it, but everybody, of course, has different study style. For me, questions are helpful, but I also like to have some videos and kind of more like a broad way to try to cover all the topics. So that worked well for me in conjunction with also doing the prep questions and going through West. Any other resources that you guys use that we haven't discussed yet?
I think that covers it.
Okay, great. So now we can talk a little bit about a study timeline and how we like approached and planned our studying. Ryan, do you want to talk about what you did?
Yeah, so I studied for somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. I didn't get a formal calendar and go, this day I'm going to do this day I'm going to do this. Instead, I tried like on a weekly basis to say that I wanted to get through this number of questions, and it allowed me some flexibility with clinics or with service responsibilities to be able to adjust on a daily basis. But I tried to do questions throughout the week if I had some downtime and found that to be quite helpful. Most of the questions had applications that you could pull up on your smartphone or tablet to be able to help facilitate that too.
Great. And then Trisha?
Yeah, my approach was similar. It was probably about, 6 to 8 weeks ahead of exam time. I tried to really make sure I just had dedicated study time in my schedule. For me, just putting things on a calendar, even if it's not necessarily specific to a certain topic, but just like, okay, today between 1 and 3, I'm going to do, board prep, was the best way to stay on track with that, because we all know as, early career faculty, our calendars and schedules fill up. So blocking that time out was key. I definitely realized quickly that I couldn't just fit it in where there was time or it would potentially not happen. So yeah, I didn't, it wasn't always the same amount of time each day, but I would just try to find a few hours throughout the week to fit that in. Tried to divide up the number of questions by, how much time, there was to study to get through them. I wanted to get through them all once. I didn't make it all the way through them 2 times like Ryan did, but to try to get through them once and then have time to go back and review the ones that I needed extra time on. So yeah, I think a pretty similar approach, and then a little more focused time in the last kind of couple weeks up to the leading up to the exam.
I was going to say, I would agree with Trisha too. One of the things I did when I was going back through the second time, if I had questions that I still felt like I was struggling a little bit with, I would bookmark those and sort of reinforce those topics in the week right before the exam.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. I had a fairly different approach, I guess. I'm like kind of neurotic when it comes to like planning study periods. And this is like what I did for PEDS boards and for like even back for step exams. But I like to make like a very dedicated calendar. And for me, I just allotted like 1 hour per day for the 3 months leading up to the exam. I had an infant at home at the time, and that was like literally all that I could squeeze in with my like clinical and research and like home responsibilities. So I knew I had to start earlier since I'd have like limited time each day to study. But for me, I literally printed off a calendar for each of the 3 months leading up to the exam. And I wrote down the topics and materials that I wanted to cover. And then I would assign them to like the days and weeks on my calendar based on my schedule. So I'd make sure like not to assign myself a hard topic on a day when I knew I'd be busy, like if I had a full day of clinic. And then, like any of the weeks that I had inpatient service during that time, I would like just not assign anything for those days. And then I would also just give myself a random day off periodically to just like have a calm evening. um, I would say if you have any like CME days that you can use at your institution, it can be super helpful to schedule some of these during the time period for more intensive study days, particularly if you do end up taking like a course that does have CME attached to it. So I had a couple of those days. And then I tried to leave time similar to what Ryan and Trisha did. I tried to leave some time in like the final week where I could review topics that were my weaknesses and review some of the questions that were on harder topics. I also saved some of the prep questions so that they were like, quote, new to me in the final days going up to the exam, just to try to assess like how much I had learned with my studying, so that I wouldn't be biased by like remembering the answer from having done it previously. But I think this just shows like everybody has different approaches and like different things work for different people. And so it's really just about knowing like what works for you and trying to play into your strengths and knowing your weaknesses and just like planning ahead to make sure that you are giving yourself enough time to cover things with the amount of time that you have. Trisha or Ryan, do you guys have any other thoughts about planning your studying period?
No, I think those are all great points. By the time you're getting to your, pulmonary boards, we've all taken enough exams throughout our medical career that we probably now know what works well and doesn't work well for us. So, sticking with your strengths and the things you already know will help you be successful. I think you can't go wrong with that.
Agree. And then, do you guys have any other like random tips for preparing for boards? Trisha, do you have anything?
I think it's nice to think ahead about your schedule. And when you are, many of us were starting new jobs at the time we were taking our boards. And so asking to kind of clear your calendar from, for example, inpatient service or call nights, things like that, that would be really disruptive to studying. Thinking ahead and just asking for that. I think most institutions are willing to accommodate a request like that if you plan it in advance.
Yeah, that's a great tip.
I agree. I was intentional with my division leadership as well, and had some protected time around that area. The other thing that I would say too, it's really easy to get sucked into, all of the clinical responsibilities or research responsibilities and stress with the study. But I think it's also really important to make sure you take time to sleep and exercise, and still do things to take care of yourself in the midst of all of the studying, so you can be fresh and focused when you are studying.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm like useless. It's actually like pointless for me to try to study when I'm just exhausted. So there were times that I did deviate from my like really neurotic calendar because I just knew today was not a day that I would do any meaningful studying. And then since I built in some days off, I would like reassign that topic to a different day. So yeah, taking care of yourself is super important. And then one other thing I'll say for just like tips for board preparation, when I don't know if it's too late for the registration standpoint, but when I was choosing a testing center, there was nothing within like 6 hours of Pittsburgh that was open. And so I actually emailed the ABP asking if they could open up a registration slot closer to me, and they did it. So if anybody else is in that situation, it might be worth reaching out to the ABP to avoid having to like fly to a test site. I think maybe they just don't know like where the people are who are taking the board that year. So they don't know where to open up the spots. But the worst thing that happens is that they say no. So it's worth a try.
Oh, I did just think of one other thing that I did. But from some of the physiology, I did have some equations that I wanted to know for the test. And so one of the things that I did is I actually practiced a day or two before, like writing the equations down. When I first got into the test center that morning, the first thing I did was write all of those down on the sheet of laminated paper that they gave me. So I didn't have to worry about those in the midst of the test. But I found it helpful to be able to practice that ahead of time too.
I forgot I actually did that too. And that just like took some of the stress out of the morning. Well, thanks so much, Trisha and Ryan, for sharing your insights today. And hopefully, listeners find this useful. And we wish you all the best of luck for your boards this year. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more, visit our website at thoracic.org. Find more podcasts from the ATS assemblies on YouTube. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a show.